A whisper in the dark. Imagine this. You and I are sitting on a wooden porch. It is late in the evening. The air is cool and still. Somewhere out in the dark, a cricket sings a slow and steady note. The boards under our feet still hold the warmth from the sun that left hours ago. We are not in a hurry. There is no place to be. Only this chair, only the quiet, only the kind of night where you can hear your own breath. Now, close your eyes, because tonight we are going to the very beginning. Not the beginning of a year, not the beginning of a country, the beginning of everything. Before there were oceans, before there was land, before even the stars had names, there was only chaos. Not the kind of chaos you hear about in traffic reports or news headlines. Not noise, not confusion. Chaos was something far older. It was a stillness so deep it made time itself seem shy. It was a space without walls, a breath without a chest, a silence so wide you could have walked for 1,000,000 miles and never heard your own footsteps. For a long while, there was nothing else, and that was enough. But stillness has a way of growing heavy, and from somewhere inside that weight, something began to stir. A pulse, slow at first, then stronger. The first heartbeat in the history of the world. That heartbeat had a name, Gaia. The earth. She rose like a warm thought under cold stone. Her skin was the soil. Her breath was the wind we have not yet felt. She was not alone for long. From her came the mountains, sharp and silent. From her came the valleys, patient and low. She stretched out, waiting for the rest of the world to wake. Somewhere far below, another presence opened its eyes. Abyss, deep and shadowed. A place so far down, even light would need a lantern to find its way. And in between them, love. Not the roses and chocolate kind, but the force that pulls things together and refuses to let go. The kind that says, you belong here. It was not yet the world you and I know. There were no rivers, no clouds, not even the sound of a leaf moving in the wind. And yet, if you had been there, if you had stood in that wide open nothing, you might have felt it. That quiet pull, the hint of something about to happen. Out of the dark came a figure dressed in night itself. Nyx. Her presence was the color of deep water at midnight. Behind her walked Erebus, carrying the darkness that lives under the earth. From their steps came the first light, a pale, clean air called ether, and with it came day, chasing night across an empty sky. They would run forever, never catching, never letting go. This was the first dance, a rhythm that would last as long as the world itself. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it now. The soft footsteps of day and night, trading places. Not far from them, Gaia lay with her eyes closed. She was thinking of someone who had not yet arrived. When he did, it was not quiet. He came as a sweep of blue so wide you could lose yourself in it. Uranus, the sky. He leaned down over Gaia. He covered her completely, not to hide her, but to keep her. They fit together like the lid on a jar. The sky above, the earth below, and in between, the first home. Some say it was the first marriage. No guests, no cake, just the sound of wind over stone. In that space between them, life began to gather, slowly, quietly, like water in the cupped palm of a hand. And if you had been there, you might have seen it. You might have felt the air change, the stillness give way to something warm. But we are not there. We are here, and tonight, we will walk from that porch into the rest of the story. Because the heartbeat we just heard was only the first. Gaia, the first beating heart. Gaia had been there since the first heartbeat. She did not arrive with a loud announcement. She came the way warmth comes to your hands on a winter morning, slowly, steadily. Her skin was deep soil, rich and dark. Her bones were the ridges of mountains that had not yet risen. When she breathed, the ground itself seemed to sigh. Above her, Uranus was still new to the world. He had the eagerness of someone who had just been given a home, and the restlessness of someone who was afraid to lose it. Gaia felt both. She lay still for a long time. Her heart beat slow, one, then another, like the swing of a porch rocker on a quiet afternoon. Life had not yet taken shape, but in her mind, it was already there. She imagined tall grasses waving in the breeze. She pictured rivers that curved like a child's drawing. She dreamed of creatures that would run, fly, swim, and laugh. Her dreams began to press against the surface of the world. The first to arrive was Milo, a small bird with feathers the color of autumn leaves. He hopped onto a flat stone and looked around as if to say, "Is this all mine?" Gaia smiled. Or at least, the earth shifted under him in a way that made him think she had. From the valleys came streams. Thin, clear water ran over smooth stones. It had no destination, no mouth to the sea, just the joy of movement. And with the water came green, small shoots at first, then taller, until they swayed in the breeze that was starting to learn its own voice. The air smelled different now, fresh, like the first opening of a window after a long winter. Far above, Uranus stretched himself wider. He wrapped the horizon. Edge to edge, every now and then, he would drop a handful of light across Gaia's slopes, just to watch them glow. They were not always in agreement. Uranus liked the high, open spaces. Gaia loved the low, hidden ones. He spoke of endless skies. She spoke of deep roots, and yet they fit. Sky to earth, breath to body, cover to comfort. One evening, if you could call it that, in a world that had just learned the difference between day and night, Gaia felt a deep ache. It was not pain, it was longing. She wanted company, not the distant sweep of sky or the small chatter of a bird, but something closer. So she reached inward. From her sides, her peaks, her caverns, she called forth her first children. Mountains rose, slow and patient. Hills curled like the backs of sleeping animals. Cliffs stood tall, their faces stern but kind. Milo flew between them, testing the air. He found the wind sharper here, and he liked the way it pushed against his wings. Gaia watched him and thought, perhaps this world would be worth keeping after all. She knew there was more to come. Ocean still waited in the folds of the horizon. Forests were seeds in her mind, and far away, something in the darkness was beginning to move. For now, she let the quiet return. The streams murmured to the stones. The wind traced its fingers across her surface. Above, Uranus lay against her like a blanket, watching over every curve and hollow. And if you had been standing there, on that newborn ground, you might have felt the beat of her heart under your feet. Slow, steady, the sound of a world that was still young enough to dream. Night, and the breath of love. The sky was wide, but it was empty. Uranus hung above Gaia, blue and still, unsure what should come next. The mountains stood like quiet sentinels. The streams whispered to themselves. Milo, the small bird, darted here and there, but even he seemed to be waiting for something. It began with a shadow, a coolness that slid across the horizon like the edge of a curtain. She stepped into the world without a sound. Nyx, night itself. Her gown was the color of deep water at midnight. Her hair moved as if stirred by a wind no one could feel. Everywhere she walked, the world grew softer. Colors dimmed, sounds hushed. Even the streams slowed their chatter. Gaia watched her with a kind of awe. So did Uranus, though he would never say it out loud. Nyx carried with her a calm that no one had felt before. It was not the stillness of chaos. It was gentler, like a hand resting lightly on your shoulder. Behind her came Erebus. He was heavier, like the weight of a closed door. He brought the darkness that lives in deep places, caves, shadows, the spaces under old roots. The two moved together, spreading their gift. Night fell for the very first time, and then, from the far edge of the darkness came another figure, Hemera, Day. She arrived in a rush of pale gold. Her light was soft, like morning sun through a kitchen window. She brought warmth that coaxed the grass to lift its head, the water to sparkle, and Milo to start chirping again. Ether followed her, carrying air so clean it felt almost like drinking cool water. Nyx and Hemera met at the line where shadow ended and light began. They looked at each other, and without speaking, began to trade places. Night would step back, day would step forward, then the other way around, over and over. It was a dance without music, yet somehow you could feel the rhythm. The mountains learned to cast shadows. The streams learned to catch light. Milo learned that some hours were for singing and some were for sleeping. Gaia felt something shift inside her. This was balance. This was the gentle push and pull she had been waiting for. From that balance came something else. It did not walk. It did not speak. It was felt, like warmth on the skin or the tug of a tide. Eros, love. He was not a person you could see. He was the space between two hands reaching for each other. He was the pause before a smile, the quiet relief of finding your way home. Eros wound himself between night and day, between earth and sky, between the wind and the feather it carried. Uranus felt it. Gaia felt it. Even Milo, the little bird, felt it when he settled in his nest. This was no longer just a world of shapes and colors. It was a world that cared for itself. The first evening came. Day stepped away. Night returned, laying her velvet shadow across the land. The first morning followed. Night bowed out. Day poured gold over the hills. It would go on like this, forever. One giving way to the other, neither winning, neither losing. And if you were there, you might have stood very still. Watched the horizon change from silver to black, then back again. Felt the air cool on your skin, then warm again. You might have understood, even without words, that this was how the world would keep its heartbeat steady. Night, day, and in between, love. The sky embraces the earth. The world was still young. Every hill, every stream, every stretch of open air still smelled of newness. Uranus floated above Gaia, watching her curves and valleys, her peaks and plains. He had never seen anything like her, and he wanted to be closer. One evening, if the word evening had meaning yet, he leaned down, lower and lower, until his vast blue swept over her completely. It was not to hide her, it was to keep her. Gaia felt the weight of him, not heavy like stone, but heavy like a warm quilt pulled over your shoulders. It was a comfort she had not known before. They fit, sky above, earth below, nothing between them but the soft hush of the wind. For a time, it was enough. Days rolled into nights, nights into days. The streams learned the patience of rivers. The mountains learned to hold their shadows. Milo, the little bird, found a perch on a tall rock and spent hours watching the two of them. Sometimes he would call out as if to remind them he was there. Uranus would rumble back a deep, pleasant sound like faraway thunder. From where he floated, Uranus could see every inch of Gaia. He admired the patterns her rivers made, the way her hills curved like gentle waves. But his closeness brought more than comfort. It brought life. Between sky and earth, small things began to stir. First, a patch of green that rolled like a carpet across the valleys. Then, clusters of flowers, their colors timid at first. The air began to carry scents fresh, sweet, earthy. Gaia welcomed each new arrival like a mother meeting her children for the first time. She spoke to them in ways only the soil understands. Her roots whispered to their roots. Her streams sang to their leaves. Uranus was proud. Every new blade of grass was a gift he thought they had made together. But closeness can also bring tension. Uranus liked the openness of the high sky. He liked to stretch without limit. Gaia preferred the quiet of hidden valleys. She liked her secrets. He wanted to look far, past the horizon. She wanted to look deep, under the ground. Sometimes, in the still hours, they would argue, not with shouting, but with silence, a silence that felt colder than night. Milo would tilt his head, sensing the change. Even the streams would run quieter until the mood passed. Yet, no matter their differences, Uranus returned each time, leaning down again, covering her again, choosing her again. One night, the air was particularly clear, the stars small. Sharp lights had begun to scatter themselves across Uranus's body. Gaia looked up at them and felt something she could not name. "These are for you," Uranus said. His voice was deep enough to roll through the mountains. "They will keep you company when I am far." Gaia said nothing, but she held the sight of them in her heart. From that night on, the stars stayed. Some nights they burned bright. Some nights they hid, but they were always there. It was a reminder of distance, of closeness, of the strange way love can be both at once. And if you had been standing in that world, if you had looked up, you might have felt it too. The pull between sky and earth, the quiet promise they kept remaking. Night after night, the titans are born. The closeness between sky and earth began to bear weight. Not the weight of stones, but the weight of life growing inside Gaia. It started quietly, a low hum in the ground, a rhythm under the rivers, a warmth that spread from the mountains to the sea. Then one by one, they came. The first was Oceanus. His eyes were the color of deep water, and wherever he stepped, streams widened into rivers. He spoke in a voice like waves brushing the shore. Next came Tethys, gentle, with hands that carried rain and mist. She liked to cup the small streams, guiding them into bigger arms. Hyperion arrived, bringing with him a light that was not the sun, but a promise of it. The air felt warmer in his presence. Then Theia, whose gaze could polish even the dullest stone until it shone. One by one, the Titans stepped into the world. Creus, Coes, Phoebe, Mnemosyne, Themis, Iapetus. Each had a place, each had a purpose. But the last to arrive was Cronus. He was quiet at first, watchful, like someone counting the hours before speaking. Milo, perched on a low branch, tilted his head as he watched them. He was not sure he liked the way Cronus stared at Uranus. It was not the look of a child at a father. It was something else. Gaia was proud. She looked at her children and saw the world filling out more rivers, more forests, more light. Even the wind seemed to carry more voices now. Uranus, however, felt something else. A tightening. He did not say it. But the sight of the Titans standing tall made him uneasy. They were strong, too strong. Still, he stayed close. He leaned over Gaia each night, covering her the way he always had. But now, the space between them felt different. The Titans began to wander. They built valleys into gardens. They carved rivers into shapes they liked. They stood on mountaintops just to see what lay beyond. Cronus often lingered at the edges, watching the sky. He would measure the length of shadows, count how long it took for night to turn into day. Milo once asked him, at least in the way birds ask questions, what he was looking for. Cronus only smiled, a slow, thoughtful smile that did not reach his eyes. As more days and nights passed, Uranus's unease grew. He began to keep some of his children close, too close. He hid the others deep beneath the ground. Gaia felt it immediately. The soil trembled with the weight of what he had done. She called to her hidden children. Their voices rose from the depths, muffled, angry, lonely. Uranus did not listen. He said it was for safety. But safety for whom? Gaia did not answer him. Instead, she watched Cronus, the quiet sun, the one who measured shadows. In her gaze, there was both hope and warning. And if you had been there, if you had stood in the space between sky and earth, you might have felt the air thicken, like the moment before a storm breaks. The Titans were here, and the world was no longer a quiet place. The blade of flint, the tension between sky and earth had grown heavy, too heavy for even the wind to carry. Gaia felt it every time Uranus lowered himself over her. The weight was no longer comfort. It was control. Her children, the ones hidden deep below, called to her from the darkness. Their voices were low, muffled by stone. They spoke of cold, of cramped spaces, of a father who feared them. Gaia's heart ached, and when her heart ached, the ground trembled. One evening, as the first stars began to appear on Uranus's vast blue, Gaia called her children who still roamed free. They gathered in a quiet valley where the grass grew thick and the air smelled faintly of rain. She looked at each of them. Oceanus, with his steady flow. Themis, with her calm and measured gaze. Hyperion, glowing softly. And Cronus, standing at the edge of the group, watching her without blinking. Her voice was low, slow, measured. This cannot continue. The others shifted uncomfortably. Even the wind seemed to step back. Gaia told them of the suffering below, of the brothers and sisters they could not see, of a father whose fear had turned to cruelty. Most turned their eyes away, but Cronus did not. He stepped forward. What would you have us do? Gaia's answer came not in words, but in an object. From the soil beside her, she drew a blade. It was not metal. Metal did not yet exist. It was flint dark, sharp, cold to the touch. The edge caught the faint light of the stars. It gleamed like a frozen drop of water. This, she said, is for the one who is not afraid to use it. The Titans looked at one another. None spoke. None moved, except Cronus. He reached out and took the blade. It felt light in his hands, too light for what it was meant to do. His eyes met Gaia's. There was no smile, only an understanding that passed between them like a shadow. From his perch in a nearby tree, Milo ruffled his feathers. He had seen many things since the world began, but this was different. This was the moment before a stone is thrown, before an arrow is loosed. Cronus said nothing to his brothers and sisters. He simply turned and walked into the night. The air seemed to follow him. The stars above shifted, as if to watch where he went. Somewhere in the darkness, Uranus moved across the sky, unaware. And if you had been there, if you had stood in that valley after Cronus left, you might have felt the ground hold its breath, because the blade of flint was no longer in Gaia's hand, and the world was about to change. The golden age. When it was over, the sky was different. Uranus was gone. Not gone from the world, but gone from Gaia's closeness. His voice no longer rolled over her hill. His shadow no longer lay across her fields. The air felt lighter, the nights quieter, and Cronus now stood where Uranus once had. He was not loud. He did not boast. He simply ruled. At first, the world seemed to breathe easier. The rivers flowed without interruption. The mountains stood in silent pride. The forest thickened, their leaves whispering in the warm wind. This was the age that would later be called golden. There were no wars, no hunger, no sickness. The Titans walked the land without fear. They tended to the rivers, the forest, the sky. They laughed together under the same sun that rose and set without fail. Even Milo, the little bird, noticed the change. There was more food to find, more safe places to nest, more warm afternoons to nap in. Cronus often walked the edges of the world. He would stop by the sea, letting the waves wash over his feet. He would stand in fields of tall grass, watching them bend under the wind from the outside. He looked content, but Gaia could see something else in him, a tension, like someone always counting the hours, even when there was no reason to. And then came the first child. Cronus and Rhea, his sister and queen, brought new life into the world. Bright, strong, full of promise. Gaia held each of them in her heart. But Cronus held them differently. He remembered the prophecy that one day a child of his would rise against him, just as he had risen against Uranus. And so, with hands that had once shaped rivers, Cronus began to take his children away, not to raise them, not to keep them safe, but to keep them from ever growing strong enough to challenge him. He swallowed them, one by one. The Golden Age did not end with a storm. It ended quietly. The fields still waved under the sun. The river still sang. But somewhere beneath the surface, the roots began to twist. Gaia watched all of it. The peace, the fear, the way history was already repeating itself. Milo sat on her shoulder one evening, tilting his head. He did not understand why the world could be so beautiful and yet so heavy. Gaia stroked his small head with a fingertip of wind, because even in the Golden Age, she whispered, the shadows never go away. And if you had been there, if you had walked through those shining fields, you might have felt it too. The beauty on the surface and the quiet storm building underneath. Rhea's secret. Rhea had learned to smile in silence. Each time Cronus held a child in his arms, each time she watched that small light vanish into him, she kept her face calm. But inside, a storm grew. The world still called it the Golden Age. The rivers still laughed. The forest still danced in the wind. But for Rhea, each new sunrise brought the same dread. Her first child, gone. Her second, gone. Her third, her fourth, her fifth, all gone. She began to wonder if she was the only one who heard the silence where laughter should have been. Gaia saw her grief. One afternoon, as the sun was sliding low, Gaia called Rhea to a quiet meadow where the grass bent under a warm breeze. Milo sat nearby, picking at seeds, pretending not to listen, though he heard every word. Gaia's voice was low. You cannot keep giving him your children. Rhea's hands curled into the folds of her gown. What choice do I have? Gaia leaned closer. You have one more chance, one more child, and this time, you will not lose him. Rhea's breath caught. Her sixth child was on the way. Gaia's plan was simple. Hide the child. Give Cronus something else to swallow. It sounded simple, but it was not. When the time came, Rhea traveled far to a cave hidden in the green slopes of Mount Ida. The air there smelled of stone and pine. The walls hummed with the sound of water dripping in the dark. There, she gave birth to a boy. His cry was strong, It echoed off the cave walls like a promise. She named him Zeus. Gaia wrapped the child in soft cloth and took him deep into the earth, where he would be safe. The nymph Amalthea cared for him, feeding him milk from a gentle goat. Bees brought him honey. The air around him was warm, as if the cave itself had chosen to protect him. Outside, Rhea returned to Cronus in her arms. She carried a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. It was heavy, but inside was not a child. It was a stone, smooth and cold. Cronus took it without question. He swallowed it, as he had all the others. And in his mind, the threat was gone. In the cave, Zeus grew. He learned the sound of rushing water, the smell of pine resin, the taste of honey. He learned the patience of stone and the swiftness of mountain wind. Milo visited often, bringing small feathers and shiny pebbles for the boy to hold. Zeus laughed when he saw them, small bursts of joy that made the cave seem brighter. Rhea visited when she could. She never stayed long. But each time, she whispered the same thing into his ear. Remember who you are. And if you had been standing at the mouth of that cave, if you had heard the boy's laughter mixed with the wind in the pines, you might have felt it too. The first hint that the golden age was ending. The young thunder. Zeus grew, not in the open fields or under the wide sky, but in the hidden heart of a mountain. The cave on Mount Ida became his world. Its walls held the warmth of old sunlight. Its shadows carried the quiet hum of the earth itself. He learned to walk on uneven stone, to balance on ledges where the wind sang in his ears, to drink from streams so cold they made his teeth ache. Amalthea, the gentle goat who fed him, watched over him with steady eyes. Her horns curved like the crescent moon. Her milk was warm, sweet, and strong enough to make him grow fast. The bees came each morning, buzzing low and patient. They brought him honey thick as summer afternoons. The nymphs played with him in the clearings just beyond the cave. They taught him the names of the trees, the voices of the birds, and the way to follow a river until it told you where to go. And sometimes Milo would visit. He would land on Zeus's shoulder, tilt his head, and tell him stories in the only language he knew. Zeus listened as if every chirp was a secret worth keeping. Even as a boy, there was something different about him when he laughed. The sound bounced in the cave like a pebble skipping across water. When he was angry, the air seemed to tighten, as if holding its breath. One afternoon, during a summer storm, Zeus stood at the cave's mouth. The rain fell in sheets, and the clouds were heavy with gray. A sudden crack of thunder rolled over the mountain. Zeus did not flinch. He smiled. From then on, the nymphs began to call him the young thunder, not because he could summon storms yet, but because he carried the same restless energy. Years passed quietly, but they did not pass without change. Zeus grew tall and strong. His eyes were clear and bright, like the sky after rain. His hands were quick, his steps sure. Gaia visited him only once in those years. She stood at the edge of the clearing, the wind curling around her like a cloak. You will leave this place one day, she told him, and when you do, the world will not be the same. Zeus did not yet understand, but he remembered her words. He also remembered Rhea's visits, few, short, but filled with a tenderness that stayed with him long after she left. Each time, she would hold his face and say the same thing. Remember who you are. And so he grew, not just in strength, but in certainty. Somewhere out there was a father he had never met. Somewhere out there was a wrong that needed setting right. The mountain kept its secret. The world beyond went on believing the last child of Rhea had been swallowed like all the rest. But in the cave, thunder was learning how to walk. The storm breaks. The mountain had kept him safe. It had kept him hidden. But mountains cannot hold back storms forever. Zeus had grown into a man, broad-shouldered, quick-eyed, carrying the strength of stone and the patience of rivers. One morning, as the mist still curled low over the slopes, Gaia came to him. Her voice was quieter than the wind. "It is time." Zeus did not ask. Time for what? He already knew. The years of honey and mountain water had made his body strong. The years of stories and whispered truths had made his mind sharper than flint. He had never seen Cronus, but he had heard enough to know the shape of his father's shadow. Gaia led him to a high ridge where the clouds moved quickly. From her hands, She brought forth a weapon, not the blade of flint she had once given Cronus, but something heavier, a sickle of shining adamant. Forged from the bones of the earth itself, the metal was cold, but it seemed to hum when Zeus touched it. "You will need this," Gaia said, "and you will need your brothers and sisters." The word struck him. Brothers and sisters. He had never seen them, never spoken to them, because they were inside Cronus. To free them, he would have to face the one who had swallowed them whole. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Find Cronus. Make him take in something that would force him to give up what he had swallowed. Zeus smiled not with joy, but with the fierce certainty of someone who has finally reached the edge of waiting. He left Mount Ida that afternoon. The air smelled of rain. The clouds gathered thick above him. Along the way, he met Metis, a titaness known for her cunning. She listened to his plan, then offered him a gift, a potion strong enough to make even a god's stomach rebel. "Give him this," she said, "and stand ready." Zeus traveled on, each step taking him farther from the hidden safety of the cave and closer to the heart of danger. When he finally saw Cronus, it was not in a palace or on a throne. It was in a wide field under a darkening sky. Cronus stood tall, his shadow long, his eyes sharp as broken stone. The two looked at each other for the first time. Neither spoke. Zeus offered him the potion, disguised as a cup of sweet wine. Cronus drank without suspicion. The effect was quick. Cronus staggered, his face tightening, and then one by one he began to bring forth what he had swallowed. First came Hestia, blinking against the light, then Demeter, coughing out the years of darkness, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Each fell to the ground, weak but alive. Zeus stepped forward, sickle in hand. "This ends now." The sky answered before Cronus could. Thunder rolled over the field. The first drops of rain fell hard and fast. The storm had broken, and the war for the world had begun. The war of the gods. The rain did not stop. It came in sheets, drumming against the earth, running in silver lines down the faces of stone. Zeus stood with the sickle still in his hand. Beside him, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon still catching their breath, still tasting freedom for the first time in years. Cronus stepped back, his eyes narrowed. Around him, the air felt heavier. The Titans were coming from the far mountains. Their shapes appeared tall, broad, their steps shaking the ground. Oceanus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and the rest, loyal to their brother. Zeus did not flinch. He had expected this. The war had been waiting in the shadows for years, and now it had stepped into the light. The first clash was not of weapons, but of voices. The Titans roared their challenge, a sound deep enough to make the rivers tremble. The newly freed gods answered with a cry sharp as lightning. And then it began. The sky turned darker, heavy with clouds that Zeus pulled close with a single thought. Thunder rolled. Lightning flashed quick, white scars against the black. Hades opened the ground beneath the enemy's feet, sending some stumbling into sudden chasms. Poseidon called waves from far-off seas, crashing them into the Titans' flanks. Demeter made the grass twist and knot, slowing their steps. Hera's voice rose like a command the wind could not ignore. But the Titans were ancient and strong. They fought with the weight of mountains, the push of oceans, the burn of old fire. For days, though, time felt strange here. The battle surged back and forth. One moment, the gods drove the Titans to the edge of defeat. The next, the Titans pushed them back with crushing force. Gaia watched from a distance. Her face was unreadable. She was mother to both sides. Every blow landed on her surface. Milo flew above the battlefield, darting between clouds and smoke. From there, he could see the shape of the war, how it twisted the land, how it scarred the sky. Zeus fought at the center. Each swing of his arm brought lightning down. Each step he took shook the air. But even lightning can falter against stone. The Titans were not falling. And so, Zeus turned to the one place no one else dared to go, the deep pit of Tartarus, a place of chains and endless dark. There, bound by thunder itself, were the Cyclopes and the hundred-handed ones, creatures of great power, feared even by the Titans. Zeus freed them. The Cyclopes forged weapons that shone with the heat of the earth's core. For Zeus, a master bolt, pure and blinding. For Poseidon, a trident sharp enough to pierce the horizon. For Hades, a helm that wrapped its wearer in invisibility. When they returned to the battle, the tide shifted. The master bolt cut through the air, striking with the sound of worlds breaking. The trident split the seas and hurled them forward. The helm let Hades move unseen, striking from shadows no one could guard. The titans began to fall back. Their roars grew hoarse, their steps slower. And then, on a day that might have been the 10th or the 100th, the gods stood victorious. Cronus was bound. The loyal titans were chained and thrown into Tartarus, the pit they had once feared. The war was over, but the world would never be the same. The age of Olympus. The war was over. The battlefield lay quiet. No roar of titans, no clash of weapons, only the low hum of the earth, settling after years of shaking. Zeus stood among his brothers and sisters. Hera, regal even with dust in her hair. Poseidon, the scent of salt still clinging to him. Hades, his eyes shadowed from places deeper than night. Demeter, hands still warm from coaxing life out of the ground. Hestia, calm as the hearth she would one day guard. They had won, but victory is not the same as peace. The old order was gone. Something new had to take its place. Zeus called them to the highest peak they could find, a mountain so tall the clouds curled around its waist. The air there was thin, sharp, and tasted faintly of lightning. From its summit, they could see all of Greece, rivers winding like silver threads, forests dark and endless, seas stretching so far they seemed to fall off the edge of the world. This will be our home. Zeus said, from here, we will watch over the earth and the people who will one day walk it. And so they began to build, not with stone alone, but with the breath of wind, the heat of fire, the strength of water, the memory of the soil. The halls of Olympus rose in gleaming white, columns carved to look like the ribs of giants, floors polished until they mirrored the sky itself. Each god took their place. Zeus on the high throne, master of the skies and storms, Hera beside him, guarding the bonds of marriage. Poseidon in halls of coral and pearl deep below the waves. Hades in his silent realm beneath the earth, where the shadows moved like slow rivers. Demeter tending fields that would feed the living. Hestia tending the great fire that burned at the heart of their home. For a time, there was peace. The wind carried laughter from the mountains' halls. The seas calmed under Poseidon's watch. The earth grew green under Demeter's touch. Even the mortals newborn in this age found their lives easier under the care of the gods. But peace has a way of softening the edge of memory. And in the stillness of Olympus, small frictions began to grow. Zeus's storm sometimes rolled too far. Poseidon's wave sometimes rose higher than needed. Hera's watchful gaze sometimes turned to suspicion. The gods were mighty, but they were also themselves proud, flawed, and unwilling to bend. From his quiet perch near the great hearth, Milo watched it all. He had seen ages begin and end, and he knew the truth. The age of Olympus would not be the last age the world would know. Still, for now, the mountain stood. The fire burned. The laughter carried on the wind. And if you had been there, standing in the white halls with the clouds at your feet, you might have believed it would last forever. The first seeds of discord. At first, Olympus was a place of harmony. The halls shone. The air was filled with music, the kind that came not from instruments, but from the wind itself. Mortals below sent prayers upward, their voices like threads weaving into the clouds. But harmony is fragile, and even the tallest mountain can feel a crack forming deep inside. It began with small things, a wave that Poseidon sent a little too far inland, flooding the edge of a farmer's field. A storm from Zeus that rolled for 3 days instead of 1. A shadow from Hades that lingered too long at the door of a mortal home. Each incident was explained away. A miscalculation, a misunderstanding, a necessary show of strength. Yet, the air in the great hall began to change. It was still warm from Hestia's fire, still bright from the sun Zeus called each day. But under it all, there was something sharper. Hera's gaze, always watchful, now lingered on Zeus with unspoken questions. Demeter's patience thinned when her fields were struck by storms she had not called for. Even Hades, who rarely spoke, began to send messages upward more often, quiet reminders that the underworld was not to be forgotten. Milo noticed it first. From his perch on a marble ledge, he would tilt his head, listening not to the words, but to the spaces between them. Silence can speak if you know how to hear it. One evening, during a feast in the great hall, a small quarrel sparked. It was over something almost laughable, a missing amphora of fine wine. Apollo insisted he had left it near the hearth. Hermes swore he had only moved it to keep it safe. Ares accused Hermes of taking it for himself. Hermes, of course, laughed it off, but the laughter was a shade too sharp. Zeus ended the argument with a wave of his hand, calling for more wine to be brought. The music returned. The laughter followed, but the crack in the mountain had widened just a little. And then there was the matter of the mortals. They were growing in number, spreading across valleys and islands. Each god claimed certain lands, certain people, and where borders met, tensions followed. Hera believed the mortals should honor all gods equally. Poseidon thought those who lived by the sea should honor him more. Demeter demanded that the farmer's first harvest be hers. Zeus insisted that all oaths sworn in any land be made under his name. It was not war, not yet, but it was the planting of seeds that would one day sprout into something far larger. From the edge of the great hall, Hestia watched quietly, tending the hearth. Her fire never faltered, but she knew even the strongest flame can flicker if the wind turns against it. And if you had been there, listening between the music and the laughter, you might have heard it too. The first faint rustle of discord. The mortal king who angered the gods, far below Olympus, in a fertile valley cut by a silver river. There was a kingdom. Its fields rolled out like green quilts. Its hills caught the gold of every sunrise. The people there lived well. The rains came when needed. The harvests were generous, and the river never failed them. Their king was called Lycaon. He was clever enough to keep his people fed, clever enough to make treaties with neighboring lands, and clever enough to hide the parts of himself that were less noble. At first, the gods took little notice of him, a mortal king. After all, ruled for only a blink in their endless lives. But Lycaon was not content with ruling just his valley. He wanted to know the gods, to test them, to see if their power was as great as the old songs claimed. When Zeus heard of this, he decided to visit the valley, not as a thunder-wielding god, but as a weary traveler, cloaked in dust. Walking alone into the king's hall, Lycaon welcomed him with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The traveler asked for food and shelter. The king agreed, but something in his manner was sharp, as if he were weighing the traveler against an unspoken measure. That night, the tables in the hall were laid with roasted meats, fresh bread, and wine dark as the river at night. But one dish was different. It was meant as a test, a cruel one. Zeus knew before he touched it. The scent was wrong. The air around it felt heavy, the way air feels before lightning. When the traveler rose from the table, his cloak fell away. The hall filled with a sudden brightness, a weight that pressed against every stone. The king fell back, eyes wide. The man before him was no traveler. He was Zeus Stormbringer, Oathkeeper, king of the gods. The thunder that followed shook the valley. The river leapt its banks. The sky split with light. When the storm ended, the hall was in ruins. Where the king had stood was a wolf, its eyes still carrying the glint of human cunning. The people whispered that he had been cursed, left to roam the forests, forever hungry, forever hunted. From Olympus, the other gods took note. The mortals could be clever, they could be bold, and sometimes they could be dangerous. Zeus looked out across the world that night and knew this truth. The line between reverence and defiance was thinner than any god liked to admit. And if you had been there, standing on the banks of that river in the quiet after the storm, you might have felt it too. A shift in the way gods and mortals saw each other, a shadow passing over the green valley. Hera's quiet war. Olympus still gleamed in the sunlight. Its halls were bright. Its air smelled faintly of cedar and mountain snow. But Hera's gaze was fixed far beyond the white columns. She had seen the storm Zeus had called down upon the mortal king. She had seen the ruin it left. And she had seen something else. The mortals were not as small as they seemed. They had courage, they had ambition, and they had the dangerous habit of challenging those above them. For Hera, it was not the defiance of mortals that troubled her most. It was the way Zeus handled it. swift, furious, public. It was power without patience, and patience was Hera's weapon. She began to move quietly. No lightning, no thunder, only small, deliberate steps. Her first war was for loyalty. She walked among the halls of Olympus, speaking softly to those who would listen: Demeter, who valued stability; Hestia, who kept the fire burning; even Hephaestus, whose hammer sang in the forges below. She spoke not of overthrowing Zeus, but of balance, of the need for a steadier hand when dealing with mortals, of the wisdom in guiding them rather than striking them down. Her second war was for influence among mortals themselves. While Zeus watched the skies and Poseidon stirred the seas, Hera sent her messengers quietly into valleys and towns. They carried her name into wedding vows. They wove her image into tapestries hung in the hearth rooms of new homes. Soon, even in places far from Olympus, her presence was felt whenever two lives were bound together. It was not the kind of war that filled the air with smoke. It was the kind that crept in like ivy, slow and green, until the stones themselves were wrapped in it. Zeus noticed the change. Of course he did, but Hera's movements were too careful to strike at without making himself look rash. And so the mountain stood in uneasy balance, lightning in one hand, patience in the other. From his perch on a high beam in the great hall, Milo tilted his head as he watched them. He wondered which would win in the end, thunder or quiet roots. If you had stood there, in that high hall with the clouds drifting below your feet, you might have felt it too, that Hera's quiet war had already begun, and no one could say where it would end. The gift of fire, far below the shining halls of Olympus, the world of mortals was changing. Villages spread like small constellations across the valleys. Fields reached farther each season, sown with the promise of grain. But when the sun went down, all that promise was swallowed by darkness. The nights were long, cold, absolute. Mortals huddled together in huts of timber and reed, wrapped in hides, whispering stories to pass the hours. The only light came from small embers coaxed from stone, fickle, weak, fading before dawn. If the wind rose, the glow died, and the cold crept in like a living thing. Prometheus watched them. He had walked among mortals for years. He knew their names. He had eaten from their tables, sat by their meager fires, and listened to the way they spoke of the gods, half in awe, half in fear. He also knew they were clever. They had hands that could build, minds that could remember, hearts that could hope. But without fire, they would never rise beyond the edge of survival. On Olympus, fire was everywhere. In Hestia's great hearth, where the flame never dimmed. In Hephaestus's forges, where metal was shaped like clay. In the braziers that lined the golden halls. The gods kept it for themselves. Fire was power, and power was guarded. Prometheus disagreed, completely, but quietly. One evening, as the mountain's shadows stretched over the sea, Prometheus climbed to Olympus. He passed the watchful peaks, the drifting clouds, the marble gates. Inside, the halls were calm. The gods were scattered, some feasting, some hunting, some dreaming in the warmth of their chambers. He walked to the forge. The room glowed with a steady red light. The air was thick with the scent of metal and smoke. On a bed of coals, a flame danced, small compared to the fires of the sun, yet alive in a way that seemed to breathe. Hephaestus was gone. The only sound was the soft hiss of heat on steel. Prometheus took a fennel stalk, hollowed from the stem, its inside dry and ready. He reached into the coals and coaxed a small flame inside. The fire curled within, its light hidden, its heat contained. He held it close, shielding it from the wind as he stepped out into the night. The climb down the mountain was slow, each step careful. The wind tugged at his cloak. The clouds pressed close, as if they knew what he carried. Below, the first stars trembled on the horizon. When he reached the mortal village, the people gathered quickly. They stared at the stalk in his hands, at the faint orange glow that escaped from its hollow. Prometheus knelt in the center of the clearing. With gentle care, he tipped the flame into a pile of dry sticks. It caught at once, flaring upward in a golden breath. Gasps broke from the crowd. Children stepped closer, eyes wide, faces painted with light for the first time. A woman held her hands to the warmth, then pressed them to her cheeks as if to believe it was real. An elder bent low, studying the flame with the reverence once kept only for the gods. Feed it, Prometheus told them. Care for it? It will serve you as long as you honor it. They did not fully understand his warning, but they understood the gift. That night, the darkness did not press against their doors. The cold did not creep into their bones. They cooked food until its scent filled the air. They sang songs in the open, their voices rising into the starlit sky. They told stories long after the hour when they once fell silent. From a branch above, Milo watched. The flicker of firelight made the mortal's eyes shine with something new: confidence, possibility. But high above, on Olympus, Zeus saw it too, and his expression was nothing like the joy below. Fire was not just warmth, it was creation, it was protection. It was a tool for building and for destroying, and once given, it could never truly be taken back. The gods had always been the keepers of such things. Prometheus had just changed that balance. In the quiet hours before dawn, the village still glowed. Smoke curled upward, drifting toward the mountain like a signal, and in the high halls of Olympus, Zeus's hand tightened on the arm of his throne. If you had been there standing in that village with the fire on your face, you might have felt it too. The world had just shifted, and there was no going back. Chains on the mountain. The gift of fire spread quickly. One village became two became 10. From the mountains to the coast, the night no longer belonged to the dark. Mortals worked after sunset. They forged tools from metal softened by flame. They cooked meals that carried their scent far into the wind. They sang in the glow until their voices gave way to sleep. But on Olympus, the air grew heavier. Zeus stood at the edge of the high balcony, looking down at the dotted fires across the earth. Each one was a star that did not belong to the sky. Hera joined him. You knew this would happen, she said. His jaw tightened. Yes, and I know who to blame. Prometheus did not hide. He stood on a rocky slope overlooking a wide river, watching a group of mortals roast fish over a small fire. He smiled at their laughter, at the way the flames painted gold across their faces. The sound of thunder rolled in not from the clouds, but from the steps behind him. Zeus came alone. No guards, no council, only the weight of his presence, which was heavier than any storm. You stole from us, Zeus said. I gave to them, Prometheus answered. They were not ready. They will never be ready, Prometheus said. If you keep everything locked away, the wind moved between them, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Zeus's eyes were cold. Then you will watch what your gift costs you. The punishment was not swift. It was deliberate. On the highest peak of the Caucasus Mountains, where the wind cut like glass and the snow never fully melted, Zeus ordered chains of unbreakable bronze to be forged. Hephaestus made them in silence, his hammer ringing against the anvil like a slow heartbeat. Prometheus was taken there at dawn. The climb was steep. The air thinned until every breath burned in his chest. Milo followed from a distance, his small wings beating hard against the icy gusts. At the summit, there was nothing but rock, the sky, and endless white. They bound Prometheus to the stone, chains at his wrists, chains at his ankles, chains across his chest so he could not turn away from the horizon. Zeus stood over him. You will not die, he said. You will not sleep, and every day you will feel the price of your defiance. Prometheus met his gaze without fear. If the price is for giving them a future, then I accept it. Zeus turned away. From the sky came the beating of vast wings. An eagle descended its shadow covering the rock, its talons curling like hooked knives. It landed beside Prometheus, its eyes bright with hunger. Each day, it would come. Each day, it would tear from him what would grow back by night, an unending cycle. The first strike came sharp and sudden. Prometheus gritted his teeth but made no sound. Zeus did not look back as he walked into the mist. Days became weeks. Weeks became years. The wind sang in high, cold tones around the peak. Snow gathered in the cracks of stone, and still the chains held. Sometimes, mortals passed in the valleys below, seeing a distant figure on the mountain. They spoke of him in whispers, half man, half legend. In the evenings, the fires in their villages still burned. Children still laughed. Songs still rose into the night, and though he never said it aloud, Prometheus heard them. The sound traveled on the wind. Soft as a memory, it was enough. Milo often came to perch on the chain at his wrist. The little bird said nothing what could be said, but stayed until the eagle's shadow grew again. If you had stood there, high on that frozen peak, you would have seen it too. That even in the grip of punishment, Prometheus had not lost the one thing Zeus could not chain: his choice. The bridge to now, the mountain has not moved. Not in thousands of years. It still stands where the wind cuts like glass, where the snow never fully melts, but the world below has changed. The fires Prometheus gave to mortals spread far beyond the first village. They crossed mountains. They lit ships on dark seas. They turned iron into plows, stone into towers, words into books. From the heights of Olympus, the gods watched and slowly faded from mortal sight, not because they were gone, but because mortals learned to tell their stories without needing to look up. Some say Prometheus still hangs there, high on the Caucasus peak. Others say the chains have long since rusted away, leaving him free to walk among men. Perhaps both are true. If you climb high enough, there is a point where the air thins and the world below turns to mist. In the silence, you might hear a chain rattle, or you might hear nothing at all, only the sound of your own breath. Milo has been there. He goes often, though he never stays long. He lands on the rock where the chains once lay. He looks out over a world that now glows with a million fires, some warm, some dangerous. The bridge between then and now is not made of stone. It is made of memory, of stories told beside campfires, of names carved into wood, of warnings whispered to children. In every flame, there is a little of Prometheus's gift. In every invention, a little of his defiance. In every choice to give, even at a cost, a little of his heart. And yet, the gods are not gone. They live in the moments when lightning splits the sky, when the sea rises without warning, when the wind carries a voice you thought you'd forgotten. One autumn night, in a small American town, a family sat by a wood stove. Outside, the trees rattled with dry leaves. Inside, the fire cracked softly, throwing gold light on the walls. The father told his children a story about a man who stole fire from the gods, about the price he paid, about why the gift mattered enough to suffer for. The children listened. The youngest leaned closer to the flame, eyes wide. And somewhere, whether on a mountain peak or just in the quiet space between heartbeats, Prometheus smiled. The bridge to now is simple. It is this: the fire you hold tonight is the same fire they held then. If you have ever warmed your hands over a flame, if you have ever lit a candle in the dark, you have touched the thread that runs unbroken from the first spark to this very moment. And if you listen closely, beneath the crackle and hiss, you might hear something else, a faint heartbeat in the heat. It is the sound of choice, the one thing the gods could never change. The candle still flickering, the fire burns low. Not the great blaze of battle, not the roaring forge of a god, just a small flame, steady and warm. It sits in the corner of a quiet room. The walls hum with the stillness of night. Outside, the wind moves through bare trees with a sound like old paper tuning. A woman sits at the table. Her hands are folded, her gaze on the candle. The flame dances, bending toward her as if it knows it is being watched. She is not thinking of the grocery list, or the clock on the wall, or the letters in the mail. She is thinking of her grandmother's voice, soft, low, telling her a story in the same kind of light. A story about beginnings, about a dark world before there was fire, about gods who loved and gods who feared, and one who gave something that could not be taken back. The room smells faintly of beeswax and pine. The heat from the candle is small but present, enough to warm the skin of her hands. She leans closer. For a moment, the flame fills her vision. In its flicker, she sees mountains. She sees halls of marble and gold. She sees a chained figure, high on a lonely peak, watching the world turn far below. If the gods are still watching, they give no sign. They have always been quiet in moments like this. But the gift remains, passed from hand to hand, from age to age, from hearth to hearth. The woman reaches for the candle snuffer, then pauses. She lets the flame burn a little longer. Because somewhere, in the space between myth and memory, there is a truth. When a story is told, it burns again, far away, on a coast where the air tastes of salt. A boy sits by a fire pit in his backyard. The logs are down to embers. He pokes them with a stick, watching sparks leap up like tiny stars. His grandfather sits beside him, Wrapped in a flannel jacket, he tells the boy about chaos, Gaia, and the first sky, about battles that shook the earth, about a gift that changed everything. The boy listens, chin resting on his knees. When the story ends, he does not speak. He just stares into the embers until the last spark fades. And in that silence, the candle flickers somewhere else. The bridge between gods and mortals is not marble. It is light. It is warmth. It is the choice to give, even when it costs something. The woman in her kitchen finally covers the flame. The boy in the backyard goes inside. The night grows darker, but in 100 other rooms, in 1,000 other hearts, the fire still burns. If you could stand above it all high as the old peaks, where the air is thin and the world below is a map of glows, you would see it. A scatter of lights, some steady, some trembling, all connected, and somewhere, perhaps, a small bird still flies between them, carrying the stories in its wings. The candle is still flickering, and as long as it does, the story is not over. The story of Prometheus is not just about gods and fire. It is about the choices we make when we know the cost. From the breath of chaos, to the first heartbeat of Gaia, to the halls of Olympus and the chains on the mountain, every moment was shaped by decisions. Some bold, some quiet, some made in anger, others in love. The gift of fire was never only about light or heat. It was about trust. It was about believing that those who received it could use it to build something better in our world. We no longer need to steal fire from the gods. We have it in every kitchen, every lamp, every screen that lights our faces at night. But the question remains the same as it was then. What will you do with what you have been given? It might be knowledge. It might be kindness. It might be the chance to forgive. And like Prometheus, you may find that giving is not always safe. It might cost you comfort. It might cost you time. It might cost you a part of yourself. But maybe that is the point. I like to think that somewhere the gods are still watching, not to punish or to bless, but simply to see what we will do next. And maybe Milo still flies between the fires, listening to the stories we tell when we think no one is listening. Tonight, as you fall asleep, the fire will still burn, whether it is a candle by your bed or a quiet glow in your heart. That is your piece of the story now. If this journey has meant something to you, I would love to know. Maybe share it with someone who needs a little warmth tonight. Maybe tell me in the comments what is the fire you've been given. Or just leave a small flame emoji so I know you're out there, still listening. And if you want to walk through more of these old, quiet roads together, there are many more stories waiting. Some you may know, some you have never heard. All of them carrying a little light across the dark. Thank you for being here. Sleep well and keep the fire